Welcome to the Deep Dive. In this episode, we're taking a deep dive into a collection of thoughts, observations that you've sent us, and it's a pretty wild mix of topics. We're going to be talking about creativity, connection, design, music, perception, photography, sound, spirituality, technology, time, and even TV. It's really quite something.
It really is, yeah. There's a lot to unpack here, a real diversity of thought.
And our mission today is to try to find some unexpected connections and actionable insights within this seemingly disparate collection of topics.
It's quite a challenge, but I think it'll be a fascinating journey.
Absolutely. So let's jump right in. Right at the beginning of your notes, you posed this very fundamental question. Is the universe connected or disconnected? Now, that's a huge question to start with. What sparked that for you?
Well, it's interesting because so many of your subsequent observations seem to circle back to this idea in different ways. You talk about how creative work developed deeper connections to the past over time, often resurfacing decades later in ways that you couldn't have predicted.
Yeah. It's almost like the more time you spend engaged in creative work, the more you start to see these echoes of your earlier explorations popping up. It's like your own creative history is having a conversation with your present work.
And then you connect this to boredom, suggesting that boredom is a temporary shutdown of the mind's ability to make those meaningful connections.
Yeah, when we're bored, it's like our brains are on standby, not really firing on all cylinders, unable to spark new ideas.
So perhaps boredom is a sign that we're not actively seeking those connections, not engaging with the world around us in a curious and receptive way.
Okay, now you also brought up this really compelling idea of art and music functioning as touchstones for a future context. I love that phrase. Can you explain a bit more about what you mean by that?
What's fascinating is that you are considering that when you create something, its meaning isn't necessarily fixed in the moment of creation. It has the potential to connect with future audiences and circumstances in ways that even you as the creator couldn't have imagined. It's almost like you're sending a message in a bottle and you have no idea who might find it or what they might make of it.
Right. Makes you think twice about those doodles you did in high school.
Yeah.
You never know what future archaeologists might make of them.
Precisely. And it's a really interesting challenge to consider the future impact of your creative work, to think about how it might resonate with people beyond your immediate time and context.
Okay, now you also touch on this interesting tension between the assumption that the future will be a radical departure from the present and the hope that there'll still be a continuity of human imagination and a connection to materials.
Yeah, we often talk about the future in this really abstract digital way, like it's all going to be virtual reality and artificial intelligence. But you've also expressed this hope that we won't lose that fundamental human connection to the physical world, the tangible stuff that we create with our own hands.
That's it. Because even with all the technology at our fingertips, we still yearn to create, to make things with our hands, to feel the weight and texture of materials.
Absolutely. And you even contrasted the idea of pure automation, which you felt could lead to a certain blandness, with the possibility of incorporating randomness into the creative process, as if it were like a collaboration with chance.
Yeah, I really resonated with that because when you think about it, so much of human creativity comes from those unexpected moments, those happy accidents that break the mold.
And this tension between control and letting go seems particularly relevant now. In the age of AI art, we're grappling with what it means for a machine to create.
You also mentioned that you have a personal drive in your creative work to connect everything. And if those connections don't quite solidify, the work feels inert, even if it's technically finished.
Yeah, that's such a common feeling for artists, musicians, designers. You've put in the work, the craft is there, but something's missing. It doesn't quite resonate.
And I think it's precisely those connections, those subtle links between disparate elements that bring a piece to life.
You even did a thought experiment about how future generations might interpret art from the past. You used Brian Eno's Music for Airports as an example.
Oh yeah, Music for Airports. I love that album. And your point was that it might spark different thoughts and interpretations depending on the context in which it's heard, like how the idea of an airport itself will change over time.
Right, and how the music might take on new meanings depending on the technology that's being used to listen to it. Think of it. Imagine someone 100 years from now experiencing Music for Airports through some kind of neural implant. It's wild to imagine.
And then you offered this wonderfully succinct definition. A new piece of art is a new connection of one thing to another. So simple, but so profound.
I mean, it really gets to the core of what creativity is about, doesn't it? It's that act of bringing things together in a way that hasn't been seen before.
You also wrote about how art has this spiritual dimension that goes beyond just being decorative. You even used 1960s rock music as an example, which is interesting.
Because it highlights how even seemingly secular forms of art can carry this deeper meaning. You mentioned that the physical object, like the vinyl record, isn't as important as the artist's intent, and how that intent is often intertwined with the social and political events of the time.
It's like the music becomes a vessel for something much larger than just the notes and the lyrics. You can feel the spirit of the times, the hopes, the fears, the anxieties of the era.
Yeah, and you even drew a contrast between that kind of music and the more top-down, intellectually driven pop music that we often hear today.
Right, that kind of prefabricated pop that's more about algorithms and marketing than genuine expression.
Yeah, you suggested that that kind of music can sometimes lose touch with the inherent connection that music has to the rhythms of speech.
It makes me think about how when we add music to language, it changes how our brains interpret it. It's not just about the literal meaning of the words anymore. It's an entirely different experience.
Absolutely. It taps into something deeper, something more primal in us.
Now, you also offered a rather critical perspective on social media. You suggested that its primary intention might be domination rather than connection or strengthening democratic values. It's a bit controversial.
But it's a really important question to consider. What are the underlying forces driving these platforms that we spend so much time on?
Right. Are they truly about connecting people and fostering genuine dialogue, or are they about something else entirely?
You seem to be suggesting that while the rhetoric might be about community and empowerment, the reality might be more about control and influence.
You keep coming back to this theme that everything is connected to something else or is awaiting a connection. It's a powerful idea.
I think it speaks to a deep human need to find patterns and make sense of the world around us. We're always searching for those connections, those threads that weave everything together.
Right. It reminds me of that famous saying, as above, so below. The idea that there are these corresponding patterns and relationships at all levels of existence.
And you even shared this intriguing thought that art can reveal things that were previously invisible. You mentioned the Mona Lisa and the possibility of diagnosing familial disease from the painting.
Yeah, it's like art can sometimes act as a lens, focusing our attention on subtle details that we might have otherwise overlooked.
And then you had this interesting observation that the moment when reality reminds you of works of art is a sign that a connection is being made. It's a moment of recognition.
Yeah, you're walking down the street, you glance at a shop window or a passing car, and suddenly you're reminded of a painting you saw in a museum. It's like the world is speaking to you through art.
Absolutely. And, you also talked about the different levels of looking. You compared it to reading.
Yeah, because just like there's a difference between skimming a text and truly absorbing the information, there's a difference between glancing at a piece of art and actively engaging with it.
And this ties into your concern about the proliferation of fake news. You suggested that fake news often preys on our tendency to recognize things superficially without really digging deeper.
It's all about that knee-jerk reaction. That's what they're banking on.
And you went on to emphasize that it's not just about the quantity of information we consume, but the quality of the connections we make between different pieces of information.
Right. It's not about how many books you've read or how many articles you've skimmed. It's about how you synthesize those different threads of thought into a coherent understanding.
And you even framed a book as a group of thoughts that get connected within the linear framework of our lives and memories.
I like that because it acknowledges the personal journey that we take with every book we read. It's not just a static object. It becomes a part of our own story.
And you made a connection between this and Marshall McLuhan's idea of the acoustic nature of connection. You contrasted this with the more attention-driven, fragmented nature of social media.
Could you explain a bit more about McLuhan's idea of the acoustic? I'm not sure all our listeners would be familiar with that.
Sure. McLuhan argued that before the dominance of the visual, there was this acoustic age where communication was more simultaneous and holistic. Think of a tribal drum circle where everyone is connected through sound in a non-linear way.
That makes sense. It's a much more immersive and participatory way of experiencing the world.
And you suggested that social media has shifted our experience of connection to something more fragmented and transactional, geared towards capturing and monetizing our attention.
It's become a bit of a commodity.
And then you shared Christy Hines' quote about valuing the right to a quiet, boring life as a critique of this constant pressure to be connected.
It's such a powerful statement, Because in a world that's constantly demanding our attention, The ability to disconnect and simply be present in the quiet moments is a radical act.
It reminds us that there's value in solitude, in silence, in boredom even.
Now, you also had this fascinating historical analogy where you linked public book readings to YouTube, libraries to TV, and then traced this evolution all the way to the internet and hypertext.
Yeah, because it's all part of this ongoing evolution of how we share and access information.
And you brought in Umberto Eco's idea of intertextuality and E.O. Wilson's concept of consilience. What do these terms mean?
So intertextuality refers to the way that texts are always in conversation with other texts. You know how a new song might quote an older melody or reference a literary theme? And consilience is the idea that knowledge from different disciplines should ultimately converge. It suggests that there's a unity of knowledge across different fields.
It paints this picture of knowledge as this constantly expanding and interconnected web.
Exactly. And, you were careful to point out that this always-on connected world has its downsides. You talked about the difficulty of disconnecting and how shared delusions can become amplified and palpable online, even giving the example of psychosomatic diseases.
Yeah, I think it's so important to remember that the internet can be this echo chamber where misinformation and anxieties can spread like wildfire.
And then you emphasize the importance of asking ourselves, where did I see that? As a way to cultivate curiosity and trace the origins of the information we encounter.
Yeah, it's a simple but powerful habit to cultivate.
It helps us connect the dots and understand the bigger picture.
Absolutely. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about creativity. You started by linking the current interest in creativity to the exaltation of the art object suffused with ego.
Yeah, there's this tendency to fetishize the art object and the artist's persona as if it were some kind of holy relic.
Right, and it can sometimes feel like the focus is more on the market value of the work than on the creative process itself.
And you acknowledge that our thinking unfolds in a linear way, but you also highlighted the influence of what you call priming, which is our pre-existing understandings and preferences.
Right. It's like our brains are always filtering new information through the lens of our past experiences.
Which can actually shape how we perceive things and what we choose to believe.
It's a bit unsettling to think about how our past can so powerfully shape our present.
And then you cautioned against creativity becoming synonymous with pointless materialism, that kind of creativity that's driven by ego or the pursuit of social media attention.
I think we've all seen examples of that. The endless stream of self-promotion and the pressure to constantly produce something new and original.
And instead of getting caught up in that cycle, you advocated for creating what you call generative frameworks.
Could you explain a bit more about what you mean by that?
Think of it like creating a system that allows for ongoing creativity, as opposed to just making isolated works. Like, for example, in music, you have lyrics, melody, and chords working together to create a song. And that song can then be reinterpreted and remixed by other musicians.
Oh, I see. So it's not just about the finished product, it's about creating something that can be built upon and expanded.
Right. And that applies to all sorts of creative fields, not just music.
It's interesting when you mentioned that even in seemingly nature-centric activities like 1950s camping, there was this presence of technology like portable TVs and radios.
Yeah, it kind of challenges that nostalgic idea of a completely technology-free past.
It's a good reminder that technology has always been woven into the fabric of our lives, even in ways that we might not always recognize.
And you also talked about the 1960s as a time that rewired a generation for free creative thinking. It was a period of huge social and cultural shifts.
Absolutely. You had the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the sexual revolution. It was a time when people were questioning everything.
And that questioning led to a much more open and experimental approach to art and creativity.
Yeah, the boundaries were really being pushed in all sorts of ways.
And you also said something really interesting about how creativity doesn't need to be forced. You even quoted that saying, "When the student was ready, the master appeared."
It's a lovely sentiment. It reminds us that inspiration often comes when we're least expecting it.
And that sometimes the best way to cultivate creativity is to simply be open and receptive to new ideas.
And you made a distinction between intention and innovation. You said that no one intends to innovate. Innovation is a goal, not an intention. But create has more intention.
Right, because when we're creating something, we usually have a specific goal in mind, whether it's a song or a painting or a piece of software. But innovation often happens as a byproduct of that process.
It's like you're trying to solve one problem, and in the process, you stumble upon a solution to another problem that you didn't even know you had.
And you even connected this to the idea of wu wei, or effortless action. The idea that sometimes the most innovative outcomes come when we're not overly fixated on the goal itself.
So it's about being present in the process and letting go of the need to control the outcome.
And you gave the practical advice to work on what works when engaging in creative endeavors.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds so simple, but it's actually really profound. It's about recognizing which of your ideas are resonating and building on those rather than getting stuck in a rut.
It's about trusting your instincts and following the path that feels most alive.
We also emphasized the link between creativity and beauty. You even drew a parallel between the rigor of playing piano beautifully and the rigor of efficient data cleaning.
It's about recognizing that there's artistry in all sorts of activities. It's about bringing that attention to detail and that striving for excellence to everything you do.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break here, but when we come back, we'll continue our deep dive into your fascinating collection of thoughts.
Looking forward to it.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Before the break, we were getting into the nitty-gritty of creativity. And you had this interesting thought about the impact of audiobooks on place memory compared to paper books.
Yeah. You suggested that the auditory experience of listening to an audiobook, especially while moving through a physical space, might create a stronger connection to that location compared to reading a physical book.
It's a really interesting idea.
Yeah.
And you also raised the question of how virtual environments might affect our internal brain places.
Right, because as we spend more and more time in digital spaces, it makes you wonder how our brains are adapting. Are we creating new neural pathways that correspond to these virtual landscapes?
It's almost a bit science fiction-y, but it feels very relevant to the world we're living in.
And you pointed out the limitations of human vision when it comes to horizontal or panoramic focus. You contrasted this with the capabilities of technology.
Right, like our eyes can only take in so much information at once, but a camera can capture a much wider field of view.
And you suggested that creative work often operates in a similar way to a shifting Venn diagram, where we narrow and broaden our focus depending on the task at hand.
Yeah, it's like we're constantly zooming in and out, focusing on specific details, and then stepping back to see the bigger picture.
And, you emphasize that a significant part of creativity is simply the investment of time in the thought process.
Right. It's not always about those sudden bursts of inspiration. Sometimes it's about patiently sitting with an idea and letting it unfold over time.
And allowing yourself to make mistakes, to explore dead ends, to go down rabbit holes.
Yeah, because sometimes those detours lead to the most unexpected discoveries.
And, you also made the point that the joy in creativity is often overshadowed by the pressure to produce, to create something that's marketable or shareable.
Yeah, the pressure can be stifling. It's important to remember the inherent pleasure of making things, regardless of the outcome.
You even had a thought about why first drafts often seem bad. And you suggest it's because we're immediately comparing them to finished, polished works that we admire.
Right, because when you're staring at your messy first draft, it's hard not to think of all the masterpieces that have come before.
But it's crucial to remember that every creative work, no matter how brilliant, started as a rough draft.
So we have to give ourselves permission to be messy, to experiment, to make mistakes.
Absolutely. And, you went on to talk about how creativity isn't limited to the arts. You talked about creativity in business, where it's often about finding solutions within constraints.
And it's about having the vision to see those constraints as opportunities rather than limitations.
And you talked about creativity as a path to meaning that should be circular or spiral, integrating with all aspects of our lives.
It's a nice image. Because it suggests that creativity isn't something that we just do in our studios or at our desks. It's something that should permeate every aspect of our being.
And you had some insights into creative blocks and jams. You talked about perfectionism and fear of mistakes as common culprits.
And you pointed out that sometimes those creative jams are a result of feeling overwhelmed by too many possibilities.
Right, and that's why limitations can actually be helpful. They provide a framework, a starting point.
Yeah, it's like having a blank canvas can be paralyzing, but having a set of constraints can actually spark our imaginations.
And you quoted David Lynch, who said that your best ideas will happen within 15 minutes after you begin creative work.
Yeah, it's a good reminder to just get started. Don't overthink it. Just dive in and see what happens.
And, you also cautioned against automating creativity or imagination.
Yeah, I think there's this temptation to outsource our creativity to algorithms, to let the machines do the thinking for us.
But ultimately, that's a dead end. True creativity comes from engaging our own unique human faculties.
And as you said earlier, it often comes down to connecting those small, seemingly insignificant ideas.
It's about paying attention to those fleeting thoughts, those sparks of insight that might seem random or irrelevant at first.
You also suggested taking breaks from the constant flow of information to allow space for those insights to emerge.
Yeah, because we're bombarded with so much information these days. Sometimes we just need to step away from the screens and let our minds wander.
You made the point that while constraints can be useful for narrowing our options, the real resolution in creative work often involves considering the periphery, the things that lie outside the box.
Absolutely, because that's often where the most innovative ideas reside.
It's like we need to cultivate a kind of peripheral vision that allows us to see the connections that others might miss.
And you also warned against what you called packaged or prefabricated creativity.
It's like those paint-by-numbers kits or those pre-written song templates. They might produce something that looks or sounds like art, but they lack the spark of genuine expression.
And then you mentioned how ideas for inventions are constantly arising, even if they don't have an immediate practical application.
Yeah, like Da Vinci's flying machines.
Right. Ideas that might seem outlandish or impossible at one point in time can become reality later on.
And you mentioned the importance of mindfulness in the context of creativity.
Yeah, you described it as a state of flow that's conducive to generating new ideas.
Like being in that zone where everything just clicks.
And you also said that if art is evolving towards the experiential, then perhaps we should all strive to be artists.
I love that idea. It's so democratizing. It suggests that creativity isn't just for the select few. It's something that everyone can tap into.
And that it can lead to personal transformation, to a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
And you explored how creativity seemed to be linked to our natural sleep-wake cycles. You even speculated about how the merging of humans and machines might lead to faster, more immediate creative solutions.
Yeah, because technology is always evolving. Who knows what the future holds?
Yeah, maybe one day we'll have AI assistants that can help us brainstorm ideas or even compose music for us.
But as you pointed out, there's a lack of intrinsic reward in simply using those tools without adding our own creative touch.
Right. It's like the difference between using a filter on a photo and actually taking the photo yourself.
And you had this really evocative image where you said that creativity can make the mind less thick, but might also thin the skin.
It's an interesting paradox. It's like creativity can open us up to new ideas and make us more receptive to the world, but it can also make us more vulnerable to criticism.
I think that's the risk you take when you put yourself out there creatively.
And you talked about how ideally creative work should be global, transcending disciplinary boundaries.
Right. It's about breaking down those artificial barriers between different fields and allowing for a more fluid exchange of ideas.
You even suggested that simply posing new questions and then waiting for insight to emerge can be a creative act in itself.
It's about embracing that uncertainty, that not knowing.
It's like the creative process is a journey, not a destination.
And you advised creative people to keep lists of ideas and to work in series to allow for that natural branching and development.
Yeah, it's like tending a garden. You plant the seeds, you nurture them, and then you see what grows.
And you talked about the importance of both cultivating and pruning in that process.
Letting go of the ideas that aren't working and focusing on the ones that have potential.
And you also made the observation that the more popular elements in someone's creative life tend to gain momentum, referencing David Bowie and his experience with Let's Dance.
Right, because once you achieve a certain level of success, there's always that pressure to repeat the formula.
But true artists are always evolving, always pushing themselves to create something new.
And you described this feeling of resonance in creativity that occurs when the spirit of the idea aligns with the spirit of the artist.
Yeah, it's that moment when everything just clicks and you know you're on the right track.
And you pointed out that aesthetics, while often associated with creativity, are only a small part of the equation.
It's about much more than just making things that look pretty.
It's about ideas, about concepts, about making connections that resonate on a deeper level.
You even brought up the color black as an example of how something that seems devoid of light can actually be loaded with meaning.
I loved that metaphor.
Yeah.
It makes me think of those new materials like Vantablack that absorb almost all light. They're so strange and fascinating.
And you clarified that a creative solution or a creative response doesn't necessarily involve art in the traditional sense.
Right, because creativity manifests in all sorts of ways.
And you contrasted the human approach to randomness in art with the machine-generated approach.
You said that you'd rather have a de Kooning than a piece of generative art that tries to imitate de Kooning's style.
And you talked about how interesting machine art often involves orchestrating accidents, engaging with the glitch factor.
Yeah, I think it's those unexpected moments, those glitches, that can sometimes reveal the most interesting possibilities.
It's about embracing the unexpected.
And, you reiterated your hope that human imagination and our connection to materials will remain intact, even in a future where automation becomes increasingly prevalent.
It's a reminder that there's something fundamentally human about the act of creation, about making things with our hands.
And you offered the clever and the cunning as alternatives to creativity and vice versa.
It suggests that there are different ways to approach problem solving.
And you identified the biggest challenges in creativity as knowing what not to do and having the perseverance to see ideas through to fruition.
So it's not just about having ideas, it's about making choices and having the discipline to execute those choices.
And you even suggested that creative plateaus can be beneficial, that they can force us to set new constraints and explore different paths.
It's like sometimes we need to hit a wall in order to break through to something new.
And you compared creativity to the varying ease with which we wake up each morning.
It's a great analogy because some days the ideas just flow, and other days it's a struggle to even get out of bed.
You asked this really interesting question. What current technologies will seem quaint in 50 years?
It's a good thought experiment because it makes you realize how quickly technology evolves.
And it makes you appreciate the ingenuity of the people who created the tools of the past, the archaic tools, as you called them.
And you had some practical advice for creative people. Start multiple projects based on ideas and let the ideas themselves suggest the appropriate modalities.
So don't get too hung up on the form. Let the content dictate the medium.
And for creative individuals who have been influenced by many different sources, you suggested that they eventually need to let those influences recede and trust their own internalized voice.
It's about finding your own unique style, your own way of expressing yourself.
And you defined pure creativity as that which contains no cliché or actively works to obscure it.
It's like creativity is this constant struggle against the familiar, the tried and true.
And you identified the meme as the primary predator of originality in the online space.
Because memes, by their very nature, are about repetition and replication.
And then you talked about the difference between the use of metaphors in design and in art. You said that in design, metaphors are often used as cognitive scaffolding, whereas in art, they can become an integral part of the form itself.
Right, because design is often about solving practical problems, whereas art is more about exploring ideas and emotions.
And you contrasted the spontaneous emergence of creativity with the more controlled processes of nature.
Because sometimes those creative breakthroughs come when we least expect them, like a bolt from the blue.
And you talked about the evolution of technology, how it naturally tends towards making things easier and more efficient.
Right, like technology is all about optimization, whereas human creativity is often driven by a desire to explore and experiment, to create variations simply for their own sake.
And you emphasized that the initial thinking and conceptualizing of ideas is often the most difficult part of the creative process.
And, you cautioned against relying too heavily on happy accidents. Because while they can be serendipitous, they can also lead us away from the core of an idea.
It's about finding that balance between spontaneity and intentionality.
You also advised against feeling the need to constantly remember past creative work to avoid repetition.
Yeah, sometimes it's better to just let go of the past and move forward.
And you cautioned against getting lost in the thicket of technology. That feeling of being overwhelmed by the sheer number of tools and options available.
It's a common problem these days, and you suggested that producers and engineers can play a vital role as filters, helping to curate the technological landscape so that it serves creativity rather than stifling it.
I think that's such a valuable role.
And then you said something interesting about how success often leads to imitations, whereas true innovation sparks further creativity.
It's like a chain reaction. One truly original idea can inspire countless others.
And you talked about how creativity thrives on that tension between cognitive dissonance and consonance. That push and pull between the familiar and the unexpected.
It's like that feeling of something not quite fitting, not quite making sense, and then suddenly it clicks into place.
And you said that a true understanding of one's creative process usually comes in hindsight.
Yeah, it's like we're always learning about ourselves as creators.
And sometimes revisiting and remaking older work can be helpful in that process.
Because it allows you to see how you've grown and evolved over time.
Now, shifting gears again, you had a question about whether jazz would still be jazz without its intricate harmonic rules.
It's a good question. Because jazz is all about improvisation and breaking the rules, But at the same time, it has this deep foundation in musical theory.
You argued that music, on a 10,000-year timeline, has barely changed, but its generative potential through its own attributes and technological evolution is limitless.
So you're saying that the basic elements of music are timeless, but the ways in which we can combine and manipulate those elements are constantly evolving.
And then you talked about the difference between song lyrics and poetry. You said that lyrics are often more didactic in nature.
Yeah, I think a lot of songwriters are trying to convey a specific message or tell a story.
And you pointed out that when musicality and lyrical meaning align, it can create a really powerful effect.
Absolutely. It's like the music and the words are working together to create something greater than the sum of their parts.
But you also acknowledged that sometimes music can overpower the words or even obscure their meaning.
And that sometimes the words are just there as placeholders for singable sounds.
And you compared the strength of a musical idea to good parentage.
In the sense that a strong musical idea can be transformed and expanded upon without losing its essential essence.
You know, you talked about jazz as an example and how it's evolved through this continuous transformation of chords and melodies.
Right, and how musicians often use fake books, like the real book, as blueprints for improvisation.
And then you contrasted the experience of hearing music as a style with the experience of hearing the composition itself.
Yeah, because sometimes we get so caught up in the surface elements of a piece of music that we miss the underlying structure.
It's like confusing the decoration with the blueprint.
You know, you mentioned the importance of music taking us away from spiritual passivity.
Yeah, because music can be this powerful force that moves us, that inspires us, that challenges us.
It can wake us up from our complacency.
And you identified music composition and songwriting as the first forms of